Hi everyone, and welcome to this 10th video in our series on early learning. Now today we discuss a topic that is probably one of the most exciting in all of early childhood development. Because from today's video, I'm going to start showing you how to teach your child to read. There are few things in life that are as awesome as watching a little one who initially couldn't really make head or tail of text get to the point where they finally start understanding letters and understanding sounds, and then eventually get to the stage where they can actually read a story by themselves. But as awesome a process as that is, I do want to caution you that it's not one that should be rushed. You want to make sure that your child is 100% ready before you start introducing formal reading lessons. And if I say ready, I mean that I just really want them to have very well developed pre-reading skills. Now, pre-reading skills really is everything that we have been discussing up until now. All the previous videos on auditory perception, visual perception, concept development is about getting them ready to get to this stage. And if you are new to the series, I would advise that you perhaps watch all of those videos first before you watch and implement the recommendations in this video. But if you have been working with your child for quite a while and you know that they know all of these concepts and they start to get really interested and curious about texts and reading, you can start by first just pointing out text in their environment. Now we call that incidental learning. So you're not actively teaching, you're just making them aware of it. And there are two ways really in which you want to do this. The first is just pointing out logos and names to them. Children can usually identify brand logos like the McDonald's logo or the Pick and Pay logo long before they can learn to read. And you will find logos in print all over your house. I want to show you some of the ones that I found just in my house, which are really easy to identify. So for instance, let me just grab them. I've put them all over here. The first is something like sunlight. Most of us have sunlight liquid in our home, and you'll see that this text is really easy and clear. Your child can see that quite easily. Also in things like, Mr. Min. So nice bold lettering that's clean and easy to perceive. Or in branded packaging, like this Clicks packet. Or even in some of the stationery that your child will use. Let me just find it. So, for instance, there you go. Really easy to see the Prit logo. And in fact, many children will refer to this as Prit instead of glue because it's such a common and well-known household item. So that's the one way in which you want to introduce reading and text to them. The second thing you want to do is you want to start formally printing and sticking up labels in their room or in their house for them to identify certain objects. So for instance, something like printing the word chair and sticking it on a chair, door, window, mirror, and so on. Now, there are two labels that you want to make sure that you don't miss out on. The first label is their name. You want to give them lots of opportunity to recognize that name so that they can identify it. And the second label is the word bed. Now, why is bed such an important word? Well, because it's one of the easiest ways for children to identify which way the sounds and the letters b and d go by identifying where they hear each sound in the word. So make sure you print that out and stick it above their bed. Now, make sure that when you do that, you try and use a font that is similar to the font that your child will learn at school, which is usually something that looks a bit like the grade 1 BBA font. And the next step is to start formally introducing letters. Now, there's a very specific way in which we introduce letters. The first thing I want you to be sure of is that you're introducing small letters and not capital letters. And this could be particularly difficult in a country like South Africa because most of the educational toys and educational products that get imported usually are printed in capitals. Why? Because there's a slight difference in the way that we teach as opposed to the way that children in China and America learn their letters. We start with the small letters first because, to be honest, it makes the most sense. 95% of the text that your child will see in a book is going to be in small letters. So if they can identify those, it makes them much easier for them to learn to read. And later, we just teach them which capital letter matches the small letter that they already know. The second thing you want to make sure is that you teach your child the letter sound and not the letter name. So you are going to be teaching A, B, K and not A, B, C. And then the last thing is that you want to make sure that you introduce the sounds in an order that is not alphabetic. Now, why not alphabetic? That's the most obvious way to do it, right? Well, because so many of the letters that look and sound the same appear very close to each other in the alphabet. Think about letters like B and D. I'm going to use the sound. So B and D are close to each other, as are P and Q, M and N. And so we want to introduce them in a way that makes it most easy for your child to identify each letter. And I'm going to print that out for you. I will put a photo at the bottom of this video of what the correct sequence is, but I'm also going to discuss it with you in this video. Now, because we work with children, I'm going to use the letter sounds and not the letter names. You want to start by first introducing S. And then we move on to A, T, I, P, N, K, curly K, E, H, R. And even though we don't ever pronounce the R that hard in English, you still want to teach R to make sure that it's clear and they're not confusing it with another sound. M, D, G, O, L, F, B, Q, A, J, W, Y, X, V, K, kicking K, and Z. Now, again, another caution. You want to be very careful about the way that you introduce the letter C and the 5 vowel sounds. Why? Because actually they can be pronounced in various ways. So you want to introduce C the way in which it sounds in a word like cat and not the way which it sounds in city. You want to introduce A the way it sounds in ant and actor, not the way that it sounds in words like are, ape, or all. Introduce the letter E in the way that it sounds in words like egg and elephant, not the way it sounds in elder. E as in ink and it, not as in ice. R the way it sounds in words like Oscar and orange, not the way that it sounds in words like over. And so the U, the way it sounds in words like up and us, not the way that it would sound in a word like use. Now, I do also want to point out that you will see two things as you go through this process. The first thing that you will see is that your child will very often confuse similar looking letters. The reversals are the most common on letters like B and D and P and Q. That is entirely normal for them to do for up to at least 2 years after they have learned to or started to learn to read. So don't worry too much if they're doing that. The second thing that's going to happen is I'm saying to you, be very careful about the way that you pronounce the vowels and make sure about the font that you use. Now, it's going to happen that your child is sometimes going to come across text where there is another font, so the letter looks a little bit different or sounds a little bit different to the way that they are used to. And that's okay. It's nothing to panic about. What you do is you do just then make it clear to them to say, sometimes it can look a little bit different. Sometimes we pronounce it a little differently, but you don't go into actively teaching them that yet. You just help them with the word and you continue to teach them the way that we have from the beginning. In next week's video, we are going to move on to how to introduce those exceptions. I am going to show you some ways in which you can teach your child the different letters. And the most important thing I've got to say here is that it's all about exposure. The more exposure they get to a letter, the more easily they're going to recognize and remember it. So I would say that when you start teaching the letters, you should spend at least a week to 2 weeks on each letter before you move on to the next. And some of the ways in which you can introduce letters to your child is really we actually just want to introduce it and use as many senses as we possibly can. So form it out of Play-Doh if you can. If your child is going to be writing the letter, perhaps put something textured underneath it, like sandpaper or corrugated cardboard, because your child is going to get that tactile feedback as they are drawing on these different textured materials. You can have them draw it in mud or draw it in sand if you are outside. And even if you're inside, if you have a plate that has just a little bit of a raised border or even a tray, you can fill that with things like flour or sand and have them draw in that medium what the letter should look like. Another favorite is jelly powder because it tastes so good. So this usually keeps them very engaged for quite a while as well. And you can do things like, we spoke before about the importance of spot the difference or spot an item. So I've just done that with the letters again. Like for instance, if you ask the child to identify all the letter S's and to circle it, we've just done that amongst all the various different kinds of letters. You can give them activities, for instance, like this is really 3 activities in one. So you can get them to trace the letter R, to cut the letter R, and then lastly to decorate it or to thread it. So now they've interacted with it at least 3 times before they move on to another activity. And then if you are very brave, you can cook some spaghetti and have your child use that limp spaghetti to form the different letters. A little bit messy, but tons of fun. Your children would absolutely love doing that. And then lastly is, as you go through all of the letters, keep a record by making a book, or I find that sometimes a ring binder is even easier. And then for each letter that you discuss or teach your child, make your own dictionary of words that have that letter in that, or specifically that start with that letter. So for the letter S, for instance, we've got salt, soup, sleep, snake, and sand. This is going to help your child look back on everything that he has learned. Now I discuss the next step as if it is consequential, but it's not really, because this is almost something that happens parallel to learning the letters. As your child gets to know some letters, you want to start teaching them how to put those letters together to make words. And that process is called blending. Now, blending is really, really important because up until now, we've only ever focused on identifying the first sound in a word. A for apple, B for bus. But that's not the whole story. Your child is going to start to learn to understand that, hey, there's more sounds in this word than just the A. And blending is about making all of those words or all of those sounds familiar to him. And so you want to start really, really, just make it very easy. You want to start small. Just 2 or 3 letter words you want to start with at first. And I'm going to tell you now how to do it, but as an aside, another aside, you would have seen that a few weeks ago, I posted a poster that said English is the most difficult European language to learn to read. Why is that? Well, it's because it's got all sorts of complex language rules. Things like silent letters, right? So you don't want to confuse your child. When you start teaching them to put sounds together, you don't want to use words that have silent letters. So no words like sign or lamb, for instance. English also has what we call digraphs or diphthongs. And so that's when you have different letters that make an altogether new sound. So please don't use words like lion, where that middle sound is going to confuse your child, or eagle, where they won't be able to identify the first sound really. And then lastly, English also has some sounds that are very difficult to identify and to hear. Very long sounds, for instance, like ape. So when you start teaching your child to consolidate words, to blend them, make sure that you choose words that are entirely phonetic. In other words, words that sound just the same way as they look. And what you want to do with blending is you want to just point to each letter. Let's use the word cat. So you want to say k, a, t. And then you want to drag those sounds together. Sometimes we do it too fast and children don't understand where the word comes from. So if you say k, at, cat, your child might still be a little bit confused. You want to blend like this. K, at, cat, cat. And you say those sounds slower and faster and faster and faster until your child can hear the word cat. And then once you've demonstrated it, you want to give the word to your child and have them practice doing that as well. Now, there are different games again that you can do that are really good for blending. So crosswords are really awesome, and you want to give them relatively easy crosswords. So don't give them difficult things in the beginning. Word searches are fantastic to help them identify and blend sounds. Rainbow writing is just literally very straightforward. This. And so all that we have done here is I've just written all the different sounds in different colors, because this helps your child to see that the letters are still separate, but together they make a word. And then one that I find kids usually enjoy quite a bit is what we call secret writing, or sometimes spy writing. So I will take a white crayon on a white piece of paper and write a word and give it to the kid, who obviously can't see anything, until they use some water paint or even some water with food coloring in it, and the word becomes clear. This one tends to go down really well, especially once your children start getting bored with all the other usual worksheets. Try the spy reading, definitely one I would recommend. You can also use things like Duplo, so just different sounds on different blocks, and when you put them together, it makes the word pot. Or if you have lots of these lying around, so again, ice cream sticks and then washing pigs, and your child just have to match up the different letters and read the word that makes. And I have also shown you before how to make your own puzzles, and there's no reason that you can't use old photos that should make dogs. To use some old photos or magazine pictures to make your own word puzzles as well. And, games like Scrabble, for instance, really good. You can even print out words on cards, and instead of using a deck of playing cards, use the words to play games like Scrabble, games like Snap or Go Fish, for instance. And remember that once your child has now consolidated, they understand the letters, now they understand how to put them together with the blending, this is a perfect time to now introduce the capitals. Because by now they'll feel really confident with the letters. They understand what they are, they're able to identify them, and now it'll be really easy for them to match capitals with small letters. And matching games are just the best way to do that. Now, the last aspect I'm going to be discussing with you today is something we call sight words. Now, there is a bit of a divide in the teaching world about how to teach children to read. Some people believe that you should teach them to decode words, which really means being able to identify all the different sounds and then putting them together, like we've done now with blending. And other people believe that children should do whole word reading. So that means seeing the word and knowing immediately what it is without breaking it up. I am a very strong proponent of decoding. I have not really seen whole word reading work in my practice. Children struggle with it, it often confuses them, and so for the most part we teach decoding. I suspect that confusion came in with something called sight words. Now, even though I don't believe in whole word reading, I do believe in sight words. And I'll quickly explain what those are. So in the early 1930s, 1940s, there was a teacher called, what was his name? Edward William Dolch. And what Dolch realized when he read through children's books and adult books is that there are certain words that appear very frequently. He called these high frequency words or sight words. And so he suggested that we teach children to identify those words as is, because that will really make it easier for them to read. Their reading will be more fluent. And it's a great idea because if children are able to identify those commonly found words, it gives them more time to actually spend on the decodable words that they don't know. Now, these are words, I think there are about 220 words and then 95 nouns, I think, that go with them. So it would be words like the, I, you, is, he, she, me, my, hers. And I'm going to also put a link at the bottom here to the list of, most common sight words. And you can just start showing those to your children when you start reading texts. And you basically just want to show it to them and tell them what the word is, without spending too much time on explaining the spelling rules for that word. And there are two ways to teach this. So firstly, just like we've done with all of the smaller words and the letters, you just want to have them first identify the words individually. Show it to them and have them recognize it. But sight words are only really consolidated when you have them in context. So when you are reading a book that has the word the, like 75 times on a page, that's how children really consolidate that. So make sure that you actually do it in practice, in reading. Have your children identify those words. Now, like I said, there are some much more complicated rules to reading in English. Unfortunately, it's not as straightforward as just that. You get things like the silent letters, the diphthongs, the digraphs, the long vowels, the double consonants. And I am going to show you and teach you about those next week. But even though I'm showing them to you next week, your child is not supposed to be able to do them by next week. So I would recommend that you actually save next week's video somewhere where you can access it again in a couple of months to a year's time once your child has progressed to that stage. Now, I really look forward to chatting to you guys about that next week. So, like I said, save the videos. Please feel free to share them. Make sure that you follow us on Instagram and Facebook, because that's where we put lots of tips and new ideas on. And then I will see you next week as we move on to part 2 of teaching your child to read. Thanks, everyone. Have an awesome week.